Dr. Malhotra is a consultant cardiologist, fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, president of the Public Health Collaboration, and an internationally renowned expert in the prevention, diagnosis, and management of heart disease. Dr. Malhotra was due to present evidence to UK ministers and MPs at the inaugural meeting of the new all-party parliamentary group on vaccine damage on the 16th of September, but due to the suspension of official parliamentary business following the Queen's death, the meeting has been postponed. Given the public interest in releasing these important findings, we invite Dr. Malhotra to share this evidence now without further delay. Thank you, Dr. Malhotra. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tess, and I just wanted to start by thanking Tess, the World Council for Health, and also James Wells, I think, who's been a stalwart on all of this and for organizing this event. So very briefly, I'm a consultant cardiologist. I've been a practicing doctor for over 20 years, most of that time in the NHS. I've had a number of different roles. Currently, I'm president of the scientific advisory board of a charity called the Public Health Collaboration. Although I'm speaking in a personal capacity today, I have an affiliation with Stanford, the Metabolic Psychiatry Unit, and I've also served as being on the Academy of Medical Royal College's Obesity Steering Group, and also the Choosing Wisely Committee, as well as being a member of the Board of Trustees of the King's Fund. So I'm bringing you today my clinical experience, but also some of my knowledge around health policy, because this is obviously crucial in terms of how we move forward constructively. So I want to start actually with a concept called willful blindness. Some of you may be aware of it. So it's something that all of us actually in different circumstances are very much capable of. And willful blindness essentially is human beings turning a blind eye to clear facts in order to feel safe, avoid conflict, reduce anxiety, and to protect prestige. And there's a history of many instances where even institutions have become willfully blind. Whether you look at situations such as Jimmy Savile, or the mid-staffs with the NHS, Harvey Weinstein, even to some degree, controversially maybe, me saying this, even during the whole history of what happened during the Holocaust. Many German people were probably willfully blind to what was actually really going on in those concentration camps. So I think it's something we need to be aware of, that we're all capable of in certain circumstances. And for me as well, and as I'm going to mention through my talk, I was willfully blind, certainly in relation to the vaccines and the harms, until I wasn't. And that's why it's crucial that we tackle this both with compassion, because there are many people who are still willfully blind, and I think remaining in echo chambers and pointing fingers isn't getting us anywhere. So we have to have some compassion for people who are in a position different to us. But the way to tackle it is really with the facts and to speak with empathy to people. And that's what I think we need to be doing now as we move forward. So what's worse than ignorance? The late great Stephen Hawking tells us the illusion of knowledge. So I'm going to essentially, over the next 50 minutes or so, discuss my recent findings. So this is a publication in the Journal of Insulin Resistance. It's peer-reviewed. Just to mention briefly, I know some people have been commenting on social media. Somebody mentioned I'm on the editorial board. There's very strict rules with the journal. It's like criticizing Richard Horton as the editor of The Lancet to ignore his editorials. It doesn't make sense. I don't have any financial link with that journal at all. I'm there really as in an honorary capacity. And this publication was basically initially discussed with the editor. Of course, as happens with many publications for research. Is it something you're interested in? She said, yes, Aseem, but of course this is very controversial, and I'll have a look at it and then decide whether it needs a peer review, and it will go for a peer review independently. So this took several months, actually, and it went for an independent peer review and now published. And I spent about 9 months actually conceiving the ideas, thinking about it, going through the data meticulously, and for reasons that will become apparent, I was literally eating, breathing, and sleeping this stuff for the last 9 months. So I'm glad it's finally published, and I'm going to present some of the findings today. It's in two parts. One of the reasons I also chose this journal is because the Journal of Insulin Resistance is one of the few medical journals that doesn't take funding from industry, and it also allowed me to write 10,000 words. Most medical journal articles won't get over 1,000, maybe 2,000 even as research pieces. I felt I needed to write this extensively, not just to cover the science of the COVID vaccine as I saw it as a clinician, but also to understand the root causes of the failures, because without understanding that, we can't move forward in a constructive way. So let's just very briefly, I think to understand the part, one needs to acknowledge and understand the whole. Before all of this, and even ongoing, we have this big problem in the UK, and this is replicated through many parts of the world. We have a stalling life expectancy since 2010, and in many parts of the country now, we now have many people living longer with chronic disease, so we're getting sicker, essentially. We're not getting, so that shouldn't make any real sense. With everything we know, with all the information out there, with access to information, with so-called the wonders of modern medicine, why is it that our health is now starting to get worse? And I've got to some degree, think as my responsibility as a doctor, and even to think about the medical profession, and think about, are we actually doing the best that we can do as a profession? And are we actually inadvertently maybe contributing, not deliberately, to the worsening health crisis? So this is one of the most important slides of my talk, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. And I think if people understand this in depth, then it explains many problems actually going on with the world today. So this is the evidence-based medicine triad. This is an analytical framework for teaching and practicing medicine. And I think all of us here would want our health, our mental health, our physical health to be optimized. That's called improving patient outcomes. This is, doctors, clinicians, healthcare practitioners. In order to improve patient outcomes, treat illness, manage risks, reduce suffering, we use our individual clinical expertise, the best available evidence, and last but not least, which is crucial, taking into consideration patient preferences and values. Now, this makes sense as a concept, but then if you take a step back and understand one thing, if the best available evidence is biased or corrupted or incorrect, and or you're not taking into consideration patient preferences and values, you're at best going to get suboptimal outcomes for your patients and at worst cause harm. And the problem we've got now is that evidence-based medicine has been hijacked. It has become an illusion by commercial interests. And the reason for that is, and for me, this is at the root of the healthcare crisis, is based upon a number of seven sins, if you like. So biased funding of research that's likely to be funded because it's likely to be profitable, not beneficial for patients. Biased reporting in medical journals, biased patient pamphlets, biased reporting in the media, commercial conflicts of interest, defensive medicine, and last but not least, an inability for medical curricula that fail to teach doctors how to comprehend and communicate health statistics. And this is crucial to understanding also the benefits and harms of the vaccine. Next slide, please. So how reliable, how good is the best available evidence from a broad perspective? We've given these concepts, but how good is evidence-based medicine? And the sad reality is that, John Ioannidis, who I cite as being the probably, I would say, a Stephen Hawking-like figure in medicine. He's the most cited medical scientist in the world, professor of medicine and statistics at the University of Stanford. And he wrote this great paper, which you can look up online, 2017, called How to Survive the Medical Misinformation Mess. And what he says, he names a number of factors behind this medical misinformation mess. One is much published research is not reliable, offers no benefit to patients, or is not useful to decision makers. Now, I think he's being a bit polite there. He wrote a previous paper many years before this, actually entitled, which is the most cited paper ever published, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. Okay? Most healthcare professionals are not aware of this problem. Don't think your doctor knows about this. Then doctors, and this is something part of medical training, and it's not difficult stuff, actually, when you actually spend time looking at it and understanding it properly, most medical professions lack the necessary skills to evaluate the reliability of usefulness of medical science. And then last but not least, patients and families then lack relevant, accurate medical evidence and skill guidance at the time of medical decision making. And this is also one of the things he writes in his paper, in a different paper. He says, ignorance of this problem, even at the highest levels of academic and clinical leadership, is profound. Just stay on this slide for a second, please. And I can tell you from my own discussions, I've spoken to people at the very highest levels, whether it's, three, I'll talk about that later, one was a current and 2 former Secretary of States for Health. I've spoken to people like the chair of the BMA. I've spoken to people, the chair of the medical colleges. I've had one-on-one conversations with people. And it is true that this issue is, even at the very highest levels, not fully understood. When the whole vaccine mandate debate was going on in the NHS, I did a lot of work behind the scenes and an opportunity I had in mainstream media to basically say this is unethical, unscientific, and we're going to lose lots of NHS staff, and it wasn't even practical that we should introduce this. And in one of the conversations I had at the time was with the chair of the BMA, who I know very well. And once I'd become aware of the evidence suggesting there was a problem with this vaccine, I explained to him, and he went and spoke to Sajid Javid, and we had exchanges, and those messages were going there. But one of the things he said to me, when I spent 2 hours walking him through the data that I had at that point, he said, Aseem, I can tell you one thing. Most of the people, certainly in health policy that I know, and this may include the chief medical officer, he said, I don't think they're critically appraising the evidence in the way you are. Next slide, please. The other interesting thing that John Edis points out in his paper is that the greater the now this is interesting, think about this, the greater the financial and other prejudices in a scientific field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. Any thoughts on something recently that's been extremely lucrative? Next slide. So, I've been a campaigner on this issue for about 10 years. I became very much aware there were big problems with medical research. I looked into it in a lot of detail because I, as a clinical doctor, was seeing more and more patients with chronic disease, more and more people being over-medicated, more misery, and I knew that population health wasn't improving. Of course, the obesity epidemic is part of that as well. And then in 2018, I was invited to speak in the European Parliament with a talk entitled Big Food and Big Pharma, Killing for Profit, ? And one of the things that I think that's really important for people to understand as well, trying to take the big picture view before we home in on the vaccine, is that drug companies have a legal obligation to produce profit for their shareholders. They do not have any legal obligation to give you the best treatment, although most of us would like that to be the case. And this is pointed out by Peter Wilmshurst in the Center of Evidence-Based Medicine in 2014. Peter Wilmshurst is a cardiologist. And one of the things he points out is that the real scandals is that regulators fail to prevent misconduct by industry, and that doctors, institutions, and medical journals who have a responsibility to patients and scientific integrity collude with industry for financial gain. And by that point, for me, I got to a situation where, I gave this quote, I said this, in the European Parliament, I said, honest doctors can no longer practice honest medicine. We have a complete healthcare system failure and an epidemic of misinformed doctors and misinformed and unwittingly harmed patients. Again, bigger picture view. So what is the history of the drug industry? Because of course the drug industry most medical research now is sponsored by the drug industry. Most of those clinical decisions that doctors are making in the consultation room are coming from studies sponsored by the drug industry. But there is a huge problem in terms of the impact of one over-medicated society. So Peter Gosha, co-founder of the Cochrane Collaboration, many years ago did an analysis, and his estimates are that prescribed medications now are the 3rd most common cause of death after heart disease and cancer because of side effects, and they are mostly preventable. Okay, that's pretty extraordinary stuff. And one of the other root problems behind all of this is there is a huge history, without naming any particular drug company here, of fraud. So between 2009 and 2014, most of the top 10 drug companies were found guilty of committing fraud for hiding data on harms, illegal marketing of drugs, which reached, about $13 billion US dollars. And what Peter Gosha points out in this paper in the BMJ is he says that, actually what happens is they are essentially, nobody gets fired, companies make more money from the sales of the drugs that have been marketed illegal or have been fraudulent do from the fines. So it's a cost of business for them. It's not about conspiracy theories, it's a cost of business. And I'll come on to later explain exactly what's going on with these big corporations and why they do this. And his solutions, and nothing has changed, by the way, so nothing has changed in the system, despite all this evidence of lots of harms that have happened to patients. And he says it's time to introduce tougher sanctions as the number of crimes, not the detection rate, seems to be increasing. Fines need to be so large that companies risk going bankrupt. Top executives should be held personally accountable, so they would need to think of the risk of imprisonment when they consider performing or acquiescing in these crimes. Okay, so just trying to be devil's advocate here. Okay, Dr. Malhotra, that's fine, cost of business, blah, blah, but isn't the overall effect of the drug industry great? Isn't all these amazing, innovative drugs? You hear politicians talking about innovation, all these new devices, all these new drugs. Isn't it overall going to be beneficial for us? Nothing could be further from the truth. So this is data, and I'm going to show you some other data in a minute. If you look at data from France, and this looked at almost 1,000 drugs that were approved by the regulator in France between 2002 and 2011. And what they found was most drugs were copies of old ones. So essentially, they're changing molecules here and there. They patent a new drug. And one of the reasons for that is, for basic science research, the drug companies actually end up spending about 19 to 20 times more on marketing than they do on research and development of basic science, new molecular entities. And then they looked at, okay, what drugs actually had an extra therapeutic value, were proven to be beneficial, better than the previous drug for patients. And actually that was around 8%. But if you look at the third if you just look here, more risk than harm than benefit, you'll find that 15.6%, so double the amount of drugs that were found to be beneficial, were proven to be more harmful than benefit. So what does one conclude from all of this? We just go to the next slide. If you look at the data in America, Marcia, the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, did an analysis between 2000 and 2008 of drugs in America, and basically found that only 11% of new drugs were truly innovative, and 75% of drugs are essentially copies of old ones. What else does she say? What does the former editor of the highest impact medical journal in the world, she says, it is no longer possible to trust much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Is she alone? No. I wrote this in my piece, towards the end of my piece. Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet. And I wonder whether this is a cry for help, because I wonder whether Richard Horton, and I know Richard, by the way, he lives near me. I bump into him in the street every so often. We have a chat. He's a very, very nice chap. I haven't talked to him about this specifically, but he knows I've written about him. And I wonder whether there is a conflict there, not in a bad sense, but in the sense that The Lancet, of course, takes a lot of money from industry, but maybe Richard also himself knows that there's other big issues. And he basically mentioned in an article he wrote in 2015, you can look this up, that he had it was a Chatham House Rules meeting organized by the Wellcome Trust. He said many eminent scientists were there, and he said the conclusions essentially were possibly half this published literature may be untrue. Former editor of the BMJ, Richard Smith, in an article a few years ago, wrote about the fact in British institutions there is a big problem with covering up research misconduct. And he wrote, something is rotten in the state of British medicine and has been for a long time. What's the overall net effect of the pharmaceutical industry? Certainly in the last few decades, it's very clear. It's been negative. Okay? Even if you just look at the waste, the colossal waste, and who's paying for it? We are paying for this. The taxpayer is paying for this. You've got big corporations making all this money. They also then don't pay their taxes. So we've got a system, if you like, which, it's almost like we've got a system which steals from the poor and is giving to the rich. And you wonder why society is disintegrating. Next slide, please. So what's actually going on in British institutions? So there was an inquiry set up by Sir Norman Lamb. I know Norman very well. Who was then the chair of the Science and Technology Committee in Parliament, and he set up an inquiry into research integrity in 2017, and Peter Wilmshurst just highlights a few of these issues, and he submitted evidence. I'm just going to quickly go through them point by point. So he says, academic institutions bear responsibility for the pressure to publish for career advancement that can result in research misconduct. A record of prominent publication is likely to attract future funding, which institutions demand, and good publicity, which institutions desire. Other pressures for misconduct come from association of academic institutions with industry, such as when investigators or their institutions hold patents or shares, or they receive payments from industry. So there is a financial pressure to publish research that will be profitable for the company and to suppress negative findings. Some publications are simply organized criminal activities, which may be at the behest of the sponsors when prominent academics are paid large sums of money to publish false data by industry, or a sponsor may be one of the victims when payments of conducting research are made to investigators who simply fabricate data. Medical journals have a financial pressures to publish positive findings of research on drugs and medical devices because their manufacturers buy reprints. So they pay the journals, if they get a publication, so they can use those reprints of the published article as marketing material used reps. Okay, so this can even be hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of pounds. We'll just skim through them, all the next bits, please. Thank you. To protect their reputations, academic institutions conceal research, misconduct, destroy evidence, and silence whistleblowers. I'm going to come on to that. There's a reason I'm telling you this stuff. Journals are reluctant to admit they've published flawed research, so they commonly refuse to publish failures to replicate. Fear of libel action. Now, this is too much legal power, if you like, from the drug industry. Fear of libel action contributes to the failure to expose research misconducts. Because lenient sanctions are imposed, institutions believe that the misconduct is not very serious, and potential research fraudsters are not deterred. So what does Peter Wilmshurst, in his experience in sort of litigation with the drug industry over many years, having been a researcher, and in fact, one of the interesting stories that he was involved in a drug for heart failure many years ago, he found that that drug was causing significant thrombocytopenia in about 50% of people. It was dropping their platelets, and he wanted to publish it, and he was basically threatened by the industry that he was funded by, and there was a big legal case that went on, and he won eventually. So what he says is, I believe that the best way to address the problems of research misconduct would be by making serious forms of research misconduct criminal offenses with meaningful sanctions, and have allegations investigated by a statutory independent body with legal powers. Basically, the GMC, for example, and other organizations you say are not fit for this particular purpose. Next slide, please. How bad can this be? You know, this should have probably been headline news all around the world. So there was a cardiologist, a Dutch cardiologist, who was found very prominent. His guidance on the use of beta blocker drugs for non-cardiac surgery was used in European Society Cardiology guidelines, and ultimately was found out that his research was fraudulent, completely fraudulent. And it was estimated, and he was fired from his job, obviously, and it was estimated that the use of beta blockers in a clinical setting recommended by his fraudulent research was likely to be responsible, wait for it, for 800,000 excess patient deaths in Europe. Okay, 10,000 excess patient deaths per year for 8 years. This is absolutely extraordinary. Now, this wasn't, one thing you've got to understand, this isn't all about financial gain. You know, one of the things for academics is power and prestige that comes with publications, with tenure, going further up in the department. They're not sort of rolling in lots of cash and going off on expensive holidays. Some of them may well be doing that. But for them, it's more about the power and prestige they get. And if they're supported by industry, and the problem is, university research, over the years, since the 90s, there's more and more funding coming from the drug industry. It used to be much less. And I'll come on to why that's a problem shortly. Next slide, please. So again, just as part of my advocacy, and again, this is relevant, this is all in the paper, and don't worry, it'll all make sense when you come onto the vaccine, is that I worked with the medical Royal Colleges for a year, and I convinced, and I sat on a table with all the chairs of the medical Royal Colleges, Royal College of Physicians, Royal College of Surgeons, chair of the Academy, and I said, listen, and this is partly based upon what was available. The BMJ launched a campaign in 2012 to wind back the harms of too much medicine. I said, we should coordinate this with the medical profession. Do the medical profession and the medical Royal College chairs, do they understand that this too much medicine issue is a major issue, major problem with fraud, problem with over-medication? How do we tackle this? So I convinced them, and this was a long, again, peer-reviewed paper. Two of the co-authors, I was a lead author on this. Two of the co-authors, one was the chair of the GMC at the time, and the other one the chair of the medical Royal Colleges. And basically one of the conclusions as well we said there needs to be a campaign to wind back the harms of too much medicine. And with the healthcare system as it is, doctors also have an ethical responsibility to reduce a wasted use of clinical resources, because in a healthcare system with finite resources, one doctor's waste is another patient's delay. Okay, again, really important slide. Again, crucial, and this is something that isn't happening And one of the things we mentioned in our paper is about, when we come back to the evidence-based medicine slide, informed consent must involve transparent communication of risk and benefit of any intervention, talking to patients in a way that they can understand, using numbers they can understand. Okay, so misleading health statistics is a major issue. There are many ways of presenting a benefit, relative risk or absolute risk, okay? So if you communicate relative risk, and I'll explain that very briefly, and this is not rocket science, you know, a GCSE math student could understand this very simply, okay? So if you communicate relative risk as opposed to the absolute risk, which you should be doing, it can lead lay people and doctors to overestimate the benefits of a medical intervention. So let me give you an example. If you look at data on the use of statin drugs, cholesterol-lowering drugs, to prevent stroke in people with type 2 diabetes. You look at that data. If you look at that data, it suggests that using a statin gives you a 48% relative risk reduction in having a stroke over 4 years. That sounds pretty impressive, doesn't it? But what does it actually mean when you look at the data? It actually reduces the risk of suffering a stroke from 28 in 1,000 to 15 in 1,000. Therefore, you've reduced 13 out of 1,000 strokes. If you look at the randomized control trial data, so 13 over 28 is 40 times 100 is 48%. But for an individual, what it actually means is your absolute risk reduction is 1.3%. In other words, and this is when I practice medicine, when I talk to my patients, when that data is available, I always communicate in these terms. I will say to that patient, I will not say, take this pill, you're 48% less likely to have a stroke, which sounds very impressive. I will say, if you take this pill religiously for the next 4 years, there's a 1 in 77 chance it's going to prevent you having a stroke. And by the way, this is still based upon industry-sponsored data, likely exaggerated benefits, harms underplayed. So all of that is part of the conversation. Now, mismatch framing in medical journals. How do medical journals report findings, okay? So if a treatment reduces the risk of developing a disease from 10 to 7 in 1,000, but increases the harm from 7 to 10 in 1,000, exactly the same, the journal will report the benefits as a 30% relative risk reduction, but the harms as 0.3% when they're exactly the same. How common is this? A third of the articles published in the BMJ, the Lancet, and JAMA between 2004 and 2006, it has got better, but it's still not far from perfect, use mismatch framing. This is a joke. It's an absolute farce. If it wasn't so serious, it would be a farce. It's very serious stuff. And if you present data in this way, you're going to have an exaggerated benefit of the drug, and you're going to underestimate the harms. Now, don't just take my word for it. The world-leading researcher, the most eminent person in health statistics, Gerd Gigerenzer, the director of the Max Planck Institute, former director, but at the time, director of the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, wrote in a World Health Organization bulletin, 2009, it is an ethical imperative that every doctor and patient understand the difference between absolute and relative risks to protect patients against unnecessary anxiety and manipulation. In other words, I would say it is unethical or ethically dubious to not explain to patients when it comes to drug treatment what the absolute benefits and the harms of the drug are. And then I published another paper with the chair of the medical oncology, Sue Bailey, to say that this needs to be part of medical training, because actually, interestingly, when you look at data and you present information to patients in this way, one, it doesn't cause worse outcomes. They tend to use less treatment. Patients tend to opt through informed consent to have less drugs, less interventions, less surgery. So they're less likely to get harmed, and they're more empowered, they feel more satisfied. That's what we should be doing, and it'll probably save a lot of money in the NHS. Okay. Let's get to the chase, all right? So, the COVID mRNA vaccines. So why was I willfully blind? Why was I willfully blind? I was one of the first people to have the COVID-19 vaccine. In January 2021, I helped out in a vaccine center and had the leftovers because, as you know, the high-risk people were taking the vaccine. There was a couple of personal reasons. One was my dad was very worried. We'd lost my mum a few years earlier. He was very worried and fearful of COVID, like many people were. And he was worried that I was going to get COVID and whatever else. So he was on my case. Please come and have, we can get the vaccine, help in the vaccine center, blah, blah, blah. That was one of the reasons. The other reasons was that I, at the time, did not even conceive, and I can tell you this is still a problem right now, this very moment, and I've spoken to doctors recently who still have this issue. I did not conceive of the possibility that a vaccine could cause any real harm at all. It wasn't even anywhere in my brain. It wasn't, I wouldn't even go there. You know, I was getting sent stuff which I considered at the time, and by the way, some of it may well be this, and excuse me for these terms, but I was being sent at the time stuff that I considered complete anti-vax nonsense. One of my friends is Gurinder Chadha, the film director. You may know of her, Bend It Like Beckham, Blinded by the Light, and she comes to me for medical advice all the time. And she was saying to me, Aseem, you know, I'm getting all this stuff. And I said, Gurinder, this is just complete nonsense. I said, and I still believe this to be true, by the way, when you look at traditional vaccines compared to all the other drugs we prescribe, they are probably one of the safest. And that is still true. And therefore, and I didn't come and sort of point fingers and say these people are loons or anything like that. Good Morning Britain, she tweeted out, I've had the vaccine because Dr. Malhotra convinced me, sent me some information. And then I went on Good Morning Britain, and they said, what's going on with vaccine hesitancy? I said, we have to understand where this is coming from, because we know the history of the drug industry. But I said, still, vaccines are some of the safest in the history of medicine. Next slide, please. And just to, you know, re-emphasize that, now I know there's still a controversy, and some people have got, you know, issues around other things like MMR, et cetera, but this is not part of the discussion. And if you look at the World Health Organization and you look at the data, and I've looked at this quite carefully, you know, vaccines still are probably one of modern medicine's, not all vaccines necessarily, but they have contributed considerably to improving life expectancy and probably, you know, save around 4 to 5 million lives a year according to the WHO. So that, I'm saying this is because that was my mindset, that still is my mindset when it comes to traditional vaccines. So what happened? Well, over a few months, conversations with various people started to make me think a little bit differently. So one of the people that I consider, and I won't name him, he's one of the brightest cardiologists in the country, very high scientific integrity. I worked with him, I've published with him, a bit younger than me, and he came to me, and he works in a cardiac center, he's an interventional cardiologist, and he said, Aseem, I just want to tell you something. I said, I met him in sort of April last year. He said, I've not had the vaccine. And I said, really? And he's a very smart guy. I mean, he publishes for fun. You know, he can take papers apart. And he said, there's something, one, I'm a bit uncertain about this new technology, which I didn't know about at the time. And he said, the other thing is, I'm low risk. And he was right. He understood that he was low risk, late 30s. He's low risk of COVID. But he said the other thing that really concerned him, he said, the supplementary appendix of the original Pfizer trial that led to the approval of the drug. He said, I'm hoping this is not a true, this is erroneous, this may be just coincidence. But he said there were 4 cardiac arrests in the vaccine group and 1 in the placebo. And he said, that concerns me. I said, okay, fine. And I kind of listened to him, but I carried on, you know. And then what happened after that is my father suffered a sudden cardiac arrest in July last year. Many of you may know of this. It was quite a harrowing experience. My dad was my best friend, last surviving member of my immediate family. I'm a cardiologist. His lifestyle was great, he was very healthy. And it was very shocking to everybody in the community because this guy was super fit, you know. I ruptured my Achilles. I was a badminton champion in Manchester School's badminton champion. After my mum's death, we were spending more time together. We played badminton for the first time in about 20 years. And I'm pretty fit. I'm not just, you know, I'm very, you know, into my fitness. And my 72-year-old dad took me to almost an hour into a badminton match where we could barely breathe. He beat me for the first time in the first game, and I ruptured my Achilles. And part of me was proud that my dad was that fit that he was able to do that. That was only 2 years ago. So all of it didn't make sense. Got a post-mortem done on him. Didn't make sense to me. You know, I'm a cardiologist that does a lot of research and understands how coronary disease develops, how it progresses. I know this in a lot of detail. He had 2 critical narrowings in his arteries. And we knew we had heart scans a few years earlier. He didn't have anything significant. His lifestyle, in fact, had got better since then. It didn't make any sense. And I just thought, what was this? Was it stress? What was it? I couldn't explain it. And then a number of things happened. Sorry, just come back. A number of things happened and simultaneously, which I know this got a lot of attention at the time. And so I got contacted by a whistleblower in a very prestigious British institution. I won't name it. But let's say it's one of the most in the world, prestigious institutions. And he told me that there is a group of researchers, cardiologists in this department, who had actually accidentally found, through use of coronary imaging, that in vaccinated versus unvaccinated, there was a huge signal of coronary inflammation related to the mRNA vaccine. And they had a meeting, and they said, we're not going to publish these findings because it may threaten our funding from the drug industry. Now, after I did this GB News interview, he then informed me, because obviously they saw it, someone saw it, non-disclosure agreements were sent out to several of these people. Now this, yeah, and I trust this person. Of course, I can't produce the exact evidence here, but let's just say I implicitly trust this person. There's no reason for him to lie about it. Where was this replicated anywhere independently with people that didn't know each other? Yes. So Stephen Gundry published an abstract in Circulation, and what he found, and this is very interesting, this really concerned me, is that within about 8 weeks of people having the mRNA vaccine and people he was following up in their middle age, there was a massive increase of coronary inflammatory markers that increased risk of heart attacks from 11% at 5 years to 25%, which I can tell you is a massive increase. Now, what does that tell you, if this is true, and it likely has some legitimacy, certainly with the data I'm going to show you now? It means that the mRNA vaccine could be accelerating coronary artery disease. So let's say you're due to have a heart attack, you don't know about this, you're going to have a heart attack in 10 years, you suddenly might be having a heart attack in 1 year. So it's going to accelerate coronary disease. That's one of the things. And the data was coming in, I got contacted by a journalist saying, we've got this unexplained increase in heart attacks in different hospitals. So I went on GB News, and I thought, okay, and of course then I thought about my dad, and I thought, listen, now I need to look at this in detail. Let me try and use evidence-based medicine. Let's look at the data properly. Let's look at absolute risk reduction. Let me look at where the harms are. Let me look in places I'd never even gone to before. And that's what obviously, the paper explains in detail. So the first thing is, well, so we talk about absolute risk reduction, and I think one of the reasons I didn't really look into this in detail at the beginning is I was under the impression that the vaccine would prevent transmission. So the numbers, it was difficult how many people would benefit, because I thought, well, actually, in the population, a vaccine that's relatively safe, if you give it and it prevents infection, even if it's 1% of people initially, it's going to have a knock-on effect and it's going to protect many more people. We obviously now know that's completely false. That isn't true. We don't even know if it was true at the beginning. But we broke down, looked at the actual data, and the original trial that led to the approval of the drug, that people weren't having informed discussions about, revealed you had to vaccinate 119 people to prevent one person from being infected with COVID-19. The original Wuhan strain. Something else I only found a few months ago, which shocked me. And this is there from the FDA. So one of the things that happened shortly after both me and my dad had the vaccine, we got sent, Public Health England, it was Public Health England at the time, sent out some free antibody tests, and they wanted us to reply to what are, pinprick on the finger, have you got antibodies? I was actually elated. I was like, the vaccine works. I tweeted it out because it was antibody positive. Is it of any use? Doesn't appear to be, not according to the FDA. In May last year, the FDA, and you can look this up, the FDA is reminding the public and healthcare providers that results from currently authorized SARS-CoV-2 antibody tests should not be used to evaluate a person's level of immunity or protection from COVID-19 at any time, and especially after the person has received a COVID-19 vaccination. Why was this not publicized all across the news? We've got these new Omicron variant vaccines that have been tested on 8 mice that are using a pure surrogate of antibodies, which we don't know has any benefit whatsoever with no clinical outcome data. This is a miscarriage of medical science. This is complete and total nonsense. So what about, so let's just accept, it doesn't have a great effect on infection, but of course the narrative changed. It's not going to prevent you getting infected, but it'll prevent you from serious illness and death. So actually working with Claire, who I've acknowledged in the paper, Claire, and the Heart Group, what we decided to do, I asked Claire to look into this. Is there some way from real-world data, not a modeling study, not extrapolations, real-world data from hospital admissions in the UK to calculate what the numbers needed to treat would be or vaccinate would be to prevent a COVID death? Now, during the Delta wave, just going to the next slide, we were able to actually look at different age groups because UKHSA had that data. We had data on hospitalizations and death, actually, per 100,000 vaccinated versus unvaccinated. Great, this is interesting. Now, there are problems with this data in the sense we don't correct for confounding factors. So, for example, as Carl Hennigan has pointed out, Director of Center of Evidence-Based Medicine, some of his patients that died from COVID-19 who were unvaccinated were terminally ill, and they decided they weren't going to have the vaccine. So this isn't corrected for that, but so it actually probably is an exaggeration of benefit. But if you look at the Delta wave, and I'm going to give you some figures here. If you look at the Delta wave, so this is the bottom slide here, looking at last year, the whole wave, 4 months, is if you look at people over 80, so we're able to separate it by age group. So you have to vaccinate 230 people over the age of 80 to prevent 1 COVID death. 520 if you're 70 to 79, 1,300 if you're 60 to 69, 2,600 if you're 50 to 59. Next slide, please. What about Omicron? I didn't put this in the paper. We only had about 3 months of data earlier this year, but this is pretty extraordinary stuff again. Omicron, how useful is the vaccine or the traditional vaccine we've been using to prevent a COVID death from Omicron, according to real-world data? If you're over 80, you've got to vaccinate 7,300 people to prevent 1 COVID death. 17,000 next decade younger. 30,000, 63,000, 167,000. This is the absolute benefit in preventing a COVID death, probably best case scenario. Now, there's something else that's important to note. The original trial, randomized controlled trial, which is supposed to correct for everything, quite a large trial, about 40,000 people, done by Pfizer and even Moderna, did not show any statistically significant reduction in COVID death. Now, for me, and there may be lots of reasons for that, it's something to think about, because it makes you wonder, hold on a minute, the gold standard trial didn't show any statistically significant reduction. Now, the argument could be it wasn't powered, it wasn't enough people, but if 40,000 people wasn't enough to show statistically significant reduction in death, it means the benefit in reducing death is probably very, very small. It's not non-existent, but it's tiny, and we come back to shared decision making. Who was told about this? Were any of you told this? No. That's where we need to move forward. We need to look at this in a bit more granular way. Okay, next slide. One of the other issues as well to mention briefly, which probably won't surprise you, when I spoke to the chair of the BMA, I mean, it's interesting, I said, he said, Aseem, I think most of my colleagues, and this is historical as well, and it may surprise you, many people in health policy actually make their decisions on media stories. So the media reporting on it. He said to me, I think a lot of my colleagues are getting information on the benefits and harms of the vaccine from the BBC. And we know that media reporting isn't very accurate. This was published in JAMA Internal Medicine a few years ago, looking at US, how accurate were health stories in terms of explaining the actual benefits or harms or whatever in intervention. And 5 of 10 review criteria were basically unsatisfactory. Costs, benefits, harms, absolute risks and benefits, quality of the evidence, comparison to new approach with alternatives, okay? So who's controlling the media? Well, certainly in America, there's a huge control of the media by sponsorship by the drug industry. Less so here, but it's still a major problem. Okay. You may stop and say, hold on a minute, see? Okay, fine, media aren't reporting it correctly. Some of these doctors may be getting information from the media incorrectly, but we've got regulators. The regulators are gonna, we should listen to them. Last night on GB News, Dan Wootton, and of course this needs to happen, we have to get responses from the regulator, went to the regulator who said, we've looked at the yellow card scheme and we can't see any link between cardiac arrest. The yellow card scheme isn't the way to look at it. It's a very interesting, carefully worded answer, by the way, from the MHRA. What's the problem? BMJ investigation done by Marion Damasi not so long ago basically showed, and in most of the funding of many countries around the world of the regulator comes from the pharmaceutical industry. Okay, 65% of the FDA, 86% of the MHRA. Now, many doctors don't know this. I gave a talk at the BMA annual conference in a fringe meeting. The chair of the BMA was gobsmacked. He didn't believe me. This is before it was published. I said 86% of the funding of the MHRA comes from the drug industry. They didn't believe. These are people who are going on TV and saying, this has been independently evaluated, right? Most healthcare practitioners are not aware of these system failures. Next slide, please. So Donald Light, in that BMJ piece, who's a sociologist who looked at the regulator over many years and how they've evaluated different drugs, this is basically what he concludes. Can we trust the regulators? Essentially, no. According to him, it's the opposite of having a trustworthy organization independently and rigorously assessing the medicines. They're not rigorous, they're not independent, they are selective, and they withhold data. Doctors and patients must appreciate how deeply and extensively drug regulators can't be trusted so long as they're captured by industry funding. Right, so do we have any high quality evidence on the vaccine harms? I've told you about the benefits that we've calculated from real world data. And this is, for me, in some ways, probably a smoking gun. The original randomized controlled trial data, this was actually initially a preprint, now it's been peer reviewed and published in the journal Vaccine, you can look this up, reanalyzed, so this was a number of very eminent scientists, associate editor of the BMJ, Peter Doshi, Robert Kaplan from Stanford, Joseph Freeman, who's a lead author I've also spoke to about this, and I'll tell you what he told me. What they found, they went back into the FDA's website, Health Canada website, and were able to look at reports, available information, looking at serious adverse events. And what they found in the original trials, where everything is corrected, it's supposed to be the gold standard, in terms of age and risk factors and everything, right, to look at where benefit of an intervention. They found the risk of serious adverse events that were reported in people in the vaccine group was significantly higher than the risk of people being hospitalized with COVID. This was the original, and this is Pfizer and Moderna trials combined. Now think about this for a second. It was these trials alone, before we had any of the data, that led to the approval and rollout of the vaccine. Not just a rollout, coercion, mandates, people being threatened with their jobs. My cousin in America, a civil engineer, was essentially told, unless you have a booster, you may probably lose your job, okay? This is just unbelievable. If this is true, and it's likely true, this is what the evidence is telling us, what's going on here? So we're talking about a rate of about 1 in 800 according to this. Now, has this been replicated anyway? Yes. Norway has been very good looking at pharmacovigilance data and assessing the actual reporting of what we call the yellow card scheme over there, specifically on serious adverse events. So after 2 doses of Pfizer, what's documented in the real world in Norway, which have been quite good at this, looking at things that cause disability, hospitalizations, life-changing event, 1 in 926. By the way, my own view is this is likely a gross underestimate, and the reason for that is because this only covers 2 months of the trial. If the vaccine accelerates coronary artery disease, of course that's one mechanism of harm, then you're going to see this over several months in causing problems and potentially cardiac arrests, which are not going to be picked up from the original trial. The other thing that traditionally pharmacovigilance data I wrote about in my paper, for serious adverse events only usually represents 10%, so what's reported is usually thought to be only 10% of the true events. By the way, I think my dad, certainly the contributing factor to his death was a vaccine. I haven't done a yellow card report. How many other people are not even aware that what's happened to Uncle Tom or one of their relatives or even themselves is linked to this? Next slide, please. Now, this is also extraordinary. The World Health Organization, before the vaccine was rolled out, approved a list of potential serious adverse effects that could happen from the mRNA vaccines, based upon a number of criteria. COVID, okay, it's one of the reasons is COVID and the spike protein in serious COVID. That's one of the mechanisms that could cause harm. The technology that was being used, animal studies, and harms that have been picked up from other vaccines. Look at this list. Just stop and look at this list for a while. The cardiac complications are extraordinary. And see, the problem is, and I see this now, I remember having a conversation very recently. So I have a number of patients, by the way, with vaccine injuries, because I've looked at it and I've looked at their history, trying to figure out what's caused the problem. One of them lady in her 50s, developed severe left ventricular dysfunction, and she's still got that within a few weeks of having the jab. Her cardiologist, her local cardiologist, dismisses it as being impossible, because they don't know. We didn't expect that something like this could do these things. Next slide. Now, is there a mechanism of harm? Potentially, yes. The spike protein, the lipid nanoparticles, and Claire will obviously, in the Q&A, maybe we'll talk about this as well a little bit later. It seems to be, there evidence suggests that it gets distributed throughout the body and can stay there for 4 months. And the mechanism of harm, this is published in Cell, suggests that it can cause inflammatory reactions or direct toxicity to the cell. So we do know there is a plausible biological mechanism of how this can harm different organ systems. Now, what's going on with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest? So the heart group are very good, and they've looked at ambulance data, national ambulance data, and essentially between 2021 and 2020, so after the vaccine rollout, we found there was an extra 14,000 out-of-hospital cardiac arrests are unexplained. You can see a blip here, by the way. It's important to note at the beginning of 2020 where these are calls for cardiorespiratory arrest. And this was, of course, during the first wave, when a lot of people were dying at home, nursing homes. We don't have the granular data, which is what we do need, where the ambulance service will have every individual patient. What was the reason for the call? Was it COVID? Was it respiratory that then caused a cardiac arrest? But that should have stopped, and it still continued well into 2021. And there was an excess. Okay, so that's one thing. It's a signal of something going on, which needs to be investigated. Next slide. Now, data from Israel, published in Nature Reports, and by the way, if you look at this, there's been a warning on that. There's a discussion going on, calls for retraction of the paper. I wonder why. So these scientists found in 2021 as well, they specifically found, this is very disturbing, but in people aged between 16 and 19, there was a 25% increase in heart attack or sudden cardiac death. 25% increase. And they specifically said this was associated with the vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, not associated with COVID. Okay, so what do we know? Let's go through these now. How do we conclude, certainly with the vaccine? I'm coming towards the end. You'll be pleased to know. I know I'm going on for a while here, but there's some important information you need to know. So, what we do know for sure, what can we conclude? There's no protection from infection now, okay? That's pretty much accepted. The initial protection from the ancestral variant seems to be, in absolute terms, about 1 in 119. There was no reduction in COVID mortality or all-cause mortality from the original randomized controlled trials. The RCTs that led to the approval of the mRNA product suggest 1 in 800 vaccinees will suffer, there'll be a serious adverse event. And then when you look at the number of absolute benefit of the Delta variant, the absolute benefit from over 80-year-olds is 1 in 230. From Omicron, it seems to be in the ballpark of 1 in 7,300. And of course, I don't want to go into detail on this, but if you look, the yellow card scheme reports are unprecedented. We've got about 500,000 reports beyond mild in the yellow card scheme, just purely from the Pfizer vaccine. AstraZeneca, when I went to look at this, I was shocked. I didn't know about this. The AstraZeneca vaccine, which was pulled in effect, but wasn't publicized, 1 million reports on the yellow card scheme. 1 million. I met Jeremy Hunt recently at a King's Fund meeting, and I was there in a Q&A. I was invited there. We had a nice chat, and I said to Jeremy, Jeremy, I've got some information coming here. I said, I've looked at this in detail. I said, it needs to be suspended. And he said, which vaccine? I thought that was interesting. And I think he was hoping, or maybe he thought I would say AstraZeneca, because effectively it's been pulled. I said, no, Jeremy, it's the Pfizer vaccine. He said, okay, email me. So I've had some exchanges with him, and he's looking at it, but unfortunately his special advisor recently replied to me, because Jeremy was on holiday, saying, Aseem, have you contacted the MHRA? Where do you go from there? And then, of course, the risk of harm seems to be, with the best quality data from my analysis, seems to be in the range of at least 1 in 1,000, okay? So we need to think about that. Okay, what's really going on here? Let's just take a step back again. I started with a broad view. I've come into the detail on the vaccine and some of the drugs. Let's go back again, because this is crucial to how we move forward, and there are solutions to this. This isn't all about doom and gloom. Let's see this as an opportunity to transform the system. So, at the root of the problem are the commercial determinants of health. How do we define that? Strategies and approaches adopted by the private sector to promote products and choices that are detrimental to health. So you see these big corporations, okay, and you can include big food into this and big pharma, okay? So what happens is they have certain practices, business practices, they have a huge impact, they call this industrial epidemic, which affects obviously planetary health, population health, and increases health and social inequalities. One of the ways it does that is, of course, is that many of these big corporations don't pay their workers properly. And I know separately as a cardiologist, there's a lot of information that's going to come soon around the impact of psychosocial stress. The impact in terms of causing heart attacks is similar to being a regular smoker or having high blood pressure. And if you were a worker in a low control, low pay, high demand job, it's effectively a death sentence. And of course, companies want to pay their workers as low amount as possible, least amount possible to generate the maximum profit. Okay, this is a really important slide, and this is very interesting. So this is a framework of how the big corporations exert their power. There are 3 dimensions to these, to how they exert their power. The one-dimensional view is power over decision-making and control over the political agenda. The 2-dimensional view, power to define issues and potential issues. And the third one, which I think is very relevant to our discussion as well, power to avert conflict and keep conflict latent. This sort of discussion is not getting to the mainstream news, partly because of the invisible, unchecked power of the big corporations, in my view. To keep conflict latent, conflict between the interests of the powerful and those who the power is exerted, because the truth is so powerful that if it gets out, of course it's going to cause conflict and it's going to threaten industry interests. There's another way of paraphrasing this. I'm paraphrasing Noam Chomsky here. Doctors, patients, and members of the public don't know what's happening, what's really happening, and they don't even know that they don't know. So, shaping the political environment, lobbying. I've spoken to politicians who are well-meaning, and some of them said to me, Aseem, I got this information that I believe to be true because of lobbying from drug industry, but no one's giving them the counter view. So they have this erroneous information, often, and making political decisions on information because of lobbying, because they're only getting half the story, which is biased and corrupted by commercial interests. What else? Preference shaping, okay? Corporate foundations and philanthropy. Bill Gates. How many of you here know that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is heavily invested in pharmaceutical industry stocks, McDonald's and Coca-Cola? Bill Gates is not interested in tackling chronic disease through dietary changes or lifestyle, and he certainly isn't interested in highlighting the excesses and manipulations of the pharmaceutical industry. I wonder why that is. Capture of the media. A lot of people's public opinion, as we know, is shaped by the mainstream media. Knowledge environment, science to specification, funding medical education. Most of the research that doctors are making clinical decisions on is funded by the industry. Legal environment, limited liability. The shareholders and the people within those companies are protected legally. Even if the corporation or the institution ends up causing harm, they are protected. Unregulated activity, extra legal environment, opposition fragmentation. If you've got whistleblowers, if you've got people who are trying to get information that's important out to the public, smear them, deplatform them. It's all part of a strategy. And what ultimately happens? It causes huge problems with population health, macro-social determinants of health. Most of what drives disease is lifestyle, diet, inactivity, sleep, and stress. These big corporations are manipulating all of that and not allowing us to lead the best lives we can lead. And of course, that affects risk factors in population health. Next slide, please. So, BMJ, about 10 years ago, and I think this is something we should all start thinking about now, corporate power, tackling corporate power should be a public health priority. We have to take the lead, all of us, in a movement away from a world driven by obedience to the corporate bottom line and the enrichment of an elite to one that prioritizes physical, mental, social, and planetary well-being. Okay, just hold on to this slide for a second. So let's just give an example. I'm going to give you one example of fraud that was uncovered, a big company, Merck, in relation to Vioxx, a drug that was marketed in the late 90s, early 2000s. I remember it was a big news at the time. This was thought to be better than ibuprofen as a painkiller because it didn't cause gastric bleeds. And ultimately, it was uncovered, even though it was prescribed to tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, that the drug increased cardiovascular risk and ultimately was responsible, certainly, for tens of thousands of cardiovascular deaths. In fact, in America, John Abramson there on the right, who's a medical researcher in Harvard, I know him, I published with him, talking to Joe Rogan here, and explains the Vioxx scandal estimated to have killed 40 to 60,000 American citizens, which was more than that was killed in Vietnam. But this is the crucial bit. I mean, this is shocking enough. He talks about an email exchange that was found during the litigation process, internal emails, when the drug was being approved by Merck's chief scientist. And he basically said that an email was circulated, so they knew when it was being circulated. It's a shame that the cardiovascular effect is there, but the drug will do well, and we will do well. Next slide. What do you call this? Now, I'm not saying this to be inflammatory. The world-leading expert on psychopathy, Dr. Robert Hare, forensic psychologist, talks about, not individuals, I'm not talking about individuals within the corp, I'm talking about the legal entity that is a corporation. It functions like a psychopath. I've called this we should maybe start talking about the psychopathic determinants of health. Think about, these are institutions that basically are there to make money through deception, reckless disregard for the safety of others, deceitfulness, repeated lying, conning others for profit, incapacity to experience skill. That is the institution that is a corporation. That's how they function. Now think about this conceptually for a second. If you have this type of institution, what's it going to do to the culture, who has increasing unchecked power over the last 2 to 3 decades, over our lives, over our work, over our decision making? It's moving away from what it really means to be human, isn't it? And that's not going to have a good effect on us on a population level. And this is really the root of the problem in my view, the legal entity that is a corporation. And what about that toxic culture? I can tell you some of my own very clear experiences. When my dad suffered a sudden cardiac arrest and there was an ambulance delay and I uncovered it and wrote an article in the newspaper about it, a cardiologist who's one of the good guys, he told me, don't expose this, Aseem, it will make you more enemies. I said, what about our duty to patients? If I had known, Department of Health and the NHS England, from a reliable source, essentially covered this up for several weeks, when they could have told people that if you have a chest pain or whatever else, probably get a neighbor to take you to hospital because the ambulance may not get there in time. It would have changed his outcome. But that cardiologist in the NHS telling me that, what is that? That's a toxic culture, isn't it? Next slide. So, we talked about Merck. Guess who Merck partnered with Facebook to control misinformation on social media? Facebook and Merck have committed $40 million to a multi-year initiative establishing the Alliance for Advancing Health Online. Next slide, please. Now, I've suffered personally, many people have suffered personally, because of these system failures over the years, because of our inability to tackle the root cause of the problem, which really are corporate interests that trump patient interests. My mum, because the NHS was already, before the pandemic, was already under so much strain. You know, she suffered an infection in her spine. Then when she was in hospital, she had a small heart attack because of stress on her body. My dad and his best friend sat by the bedside and waited for 2 hours while she was effectively drowning, waiting for treatment because it was too busy. The hospital was too busy during the weekday. She suffered unnecessarily because of that. She also had issues around addiction, food addiction, and that probably contributed to some of her health problems as well. And then, of course, my dad, suffered this cardiac arrest, and there was an ambulance delay, etc. Even though it was witnessed by 2 doctors, even though I was down the phone. And I remember it was just, when the ambulance crew turned up, they FaceTimed me and they put the monitors on. And I'm obviously a cardiologist and managed many cardiac arrests in hospital myself. And I knew he was gone. There was a flat line, 30 minutes it took for the ambulance crew to take up, because the system has been under pressure for so much time, even before the pandemic, because we have not been practicing, in my view, adhering to the principles of ethical, evidence-based medicine. So what do we do moving forward? Let's try and talk about some meaningful solutions. So, the title of the article says curing the pandemic of misinformation around the mRNA vaccine, COVID vaccine, through real evidence-based medicine. So what is real evidence-based medicine? So let's just go back to thinking about the application of individual clinical expertise with best available evidence and taking into consideration patient preferences and values in order to improve patient outcomes. Makes the ethical care of the patient its top priority, demands individual evidence in a format that clinicians and patients can understand, is characterized by expert judgment rather than mechanical rule following, shares decision with patients through meaningful conversations, and applies these principles at community level for evidence-based public health. Now, what do we need to do from a policy level, okay? Although the pharmaceutical industry plays an important role in developing new drugs, they should play no role in testing them. Enough now of this nonsense. Enough. They should be independently evaluated, and they certainly shouldn't be allowed to hold on to the raw data. All results of all trials that involve humans must be made publicly available. Regulators such as the FDA and the MHRA must be publicly funded and not receive any money from the pharmaceutical industry. Independent researchers then can evaluate evidence and look at whether the benefits and harms of all these different interventions. Medical education should not be funded or sponsored by the drug industry. I'll be honest, I've stopped going to cardiology conferences. Most of them are sponsored by the drug industry because I know the information I receive there, I can't trust it. I don't believe I can trust it. Patients must demand better evidence, better presented, better explained, and applied in a more personalized way. So we've got a mountain to move, guys, haven't we? Many people are becoming more enlightened with the situation that we're in. The structural drivers are already in place. This is not an anomaly, as far as I'm concerned, what happened with this vaccine in terms of its rollout. This was already, this sort of problem, this issue, these concerns were all waiting to happen. How do we move the mountain? This is a framework developed in Thailand, the triangle that moves the mountain. So we need to create relevant knowledge, truthful, honest, independent knowledge first and foremost. And then you need the social movement. You need people to become enlightened. Ultimately, we have the power. We have a lot of untapped power we're not using collectively. Okay? Democracy is not a free ride. We must demand. We must ask those questions, demand answers from those policymakers. And of course, then political involvement. Now, some people may have different views, smaller government, less government. No, we want better government. We want better regulation. We can't have no government, we'd have anarchy. The primary purpose of government, some of the primary purpose is to protect the citizens from external aggressors and protect their populations from disease and serve the interests of their community. Our governments haven't been doing that for a long time. Because we are not having politicians that are coming from a place of real values, from a place of integrity and honesty. And of course, that's going to affect the whole culture as well. So how do we do this? Well, I've been involved over the last 10 years as a slightly controversial cardiologist. I remember being called a quack and being attacked when I said sugar was harmful to health many years ago, publishing the BMJ, when I questioned the over-medication of statins and cholesterol. So Simon Chapman was one of the successful pioneers around the tobacco control movement in in Australia, and he talks about his 38-year career in public health advocacy and 10 pieces of advice for researchers and advocates. Okay, so media attention on a public health issue is often more effective than private advocacy in winning policy change. Advocacy must be evidence-based, clear and concrete. It's very important. Speak out publicly, study the media, and be able to speak out all times. Use killer attention-grabbing facts, but place them in the context of a values system. Care about what you're advocating for. Use real people to illustrate your message. Use social media. Be patient and grow a rhinoceros hide. Because unless you're an advocate for an utterly uncontroversial policy, as soon as your work threatens an industry or ideological cabal, you will be attacked, sometimes unrelentingly and viciously. And some of us here have experienced that. I've had that many times throughout my career. You have to have a thick skin. Next slide. And this is also crucial to where we are now. You know, medicine is not an exact science, it's an applied science. And one of the things David Sackett tells us is that 50% of what you learn in medical school, the father of the evidence-based medicine movement, will turn out to be either outdated or dead wrong within 5 years of your graduation. The trouble is nobody can tell you which half, so you have to continue to learn on your own. It means it always has to be a level of uncertainty with all this decision making. So careers are often built on a lifetime commitment to a particular phase of evidence, but if the evidence changes, it is absolutely critical, and this is for the doctors out there and the academics, for public trust in the integrity of public health, that we acknowledge the facts have changed and accordingly we have changed our minds too. So what do we conclude overall? Certainly with the information I've got available, and we look at other vaccines that have been pulled for much less prevalence of harms. Swine flu vaccine 1976 was pulled because it caused Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological condition in 1 in 100,000. The rotavirus vaccine was pulled in 1999. It caused bowel obstruction in 1 in 10,000. We've got clear evidence of at least probably 1 in 800 to 1 in 1,000 of serious adverse events from these COVID mRNA vaccines. It needs to be pulled. I can't see any case to not pull it, suspend it, investigate the harms. And also the other reassuring issue is that Omicron, what's circulating now, doesn't seem to be particularly lethal. It seems to have the same sort of infection fatality rate as a flu. So we are in a much better position that we can actually have this conversation. What should we do? How do we refocus? So we should refocus our research programs, focusing on what we call the social determinants of health. A lot of pills for chronic disease have a very marginal effect. They don't improve quality of life. I do with my own practice. It's about lifestyle, it's about diet. The research programs need to focus on those. We need to reframe our way of thinking and acting towards corporations. They are not moral beings, they are anti-human, and if we give them too much power, it's of course going to have a negative effect on society. And disconnect our research programs in terms of funding, and then we need to redesign the corporation. We need corporations, we need to redesign them through legal means, make sure that they are making money through honest means, not through deceiving us. I love this quote from Robert Kennedy. Interestingly, I spoke to his son for the very first time yesterday, who called me and was congratulating me on the paper. So we have to think about values as well. Where do we place our values? Why are we moving away from actually what it means to be human? And Robert Kennedy, I think he picked on this beautifully. The gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except which makes life worthwhile. To lead the good and happy life, ancient wisdom teaches us that we have to live in a virtuous way. Socrates, Plato, these people, unless you act in a virtuous way, you can't act necessarily in a truthful way. And for human beings to live cohesively in society, we have to be able to trust each other. And we can only trust each other if we are open and we are truthful and we are not afraid to speak the truth. And of all the virtues, the most important one is courage. Because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. Knowledge without action is vanity. Action without knowledge is insanity. And wisdom without courage is fruitless. So we need a bit more courage, Abraham Lincoln. You know, this corporate power issue has been a battle going on for probably a couple of centuries, and there's concerns. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow. And the money and power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. So it's time to rise up against this organization of misery. You know, as Harvey Milk said, rights are only won by those who make their voices heard. Hope is never silent, and hope has two daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to make sure things are the way they should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Malhotra, for being so courageous.